The countdown is on. 100 days until Michigan begins the 2017 college football season, which means it's the perfect time to debut the Michigan podcast next.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deeper in the corner. Waits for it. It's caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison.
Brady gets terrific. Throws it and a touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him. And the leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris hacks a wall of him, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Ron Robinson and Michigan.
The MVP in today's ball game. You want to know who it is? I'm standing alongside his proud daddy, the quarterback Brian Greasy of Michigan.
Greetings and go blue. My name is Steve Deace. Welcome to the pilot episode of the Michigan podcast. I'm a lifelong Michigan fan, professional broadcaster, doing this as a labor of love. Why? Well, when I figured, I do this all the time in my basement to myself or on various Michigan message boards. So let's just use my own studio that I use in my day job and slap it up on YouTube, and let's see what happens. Let me tell you who I'm not. I'm not someone that is a news scooper. I'm not going to break news. I'm not a recruiting guru. I'm a guy that just loves Michigan, looks at the various information by the professionals that are put out there, whether it's Sam Webb at Go Blue Wolverine or Chris Ballas, John Borton, and Jim S. at the Wolverine, two sites I've subscribed to for years and years, and other entities, Angelique Shengelis at the Detroit News. I just read all the same stuff you guys do. But we're going to just do my own unique brand of analysis. And who knows, maybe 5 of you will watch, maybe 5,000 of you will watch. Nonetheless, it's a lot of fun because I'm a lifelong Michigan fan, and heck, I'm going to do this from my own maize and blue man cave anyway, so why not throw it up there here on YouTube. Each week, we invite you to take part in our Twitter poll, to send us questions that you would like us to answer, and we'll get to those a little bit later on in the podcast. But first, we want to invite you to follow us on Twitter at Michigan Podcast. You can like us on our brand new Facebook page. You can also subscribe to the podcast version of this. Yes, you can get just the podcast if you want just the audio from either iTunes or Stitcher. Just subscribe to Michigan Podcast. You can also subscribe to our channel right here on YouTube. Click like on this video as well and help us spread the word. We begin with this week's big story. The big story for Michigan this week, we head into year 3 of the Harbaugh era. Now it's just 100 days away. And it's been interesting to watch the media narratives surrounding our coach. Now, for me, I'm going to admit to you, I have to fight the urge not to be a Jim Harbaugh slappy. He was my favorite Michigan player growing up. Heck, I'm the guy that when I used to create myself on the old NCAA football game, I always wore number 4. because that was Jimmy's number at Michigan. And yes, I know no one calls him Jimmy. It's just that's what I used to call him as a kid, and I've never really gotten over it because I'm a fan. And it's been fascinating to watch many of my media brethren and how they have covered Coach Harbaugh. You know, when he first came in, it was all Jim all the time, after telling us, of course, he would never take the Michigan job. He would never leave the NFL to go to college. Well, he defied that conventional wisdom. And then it was, well, yeah, I mean, we've got all these satellite camps and all these other sideshow antics, and they're a lot of fun, but he's got a major rebuilding job on his hands. I mean, hey, Michigan was the program that the year before Jim came in, they were handing out tickets with a purchase of a Coke Zero, right? Ed Cunningham was on ABC saying, hey, Michigan's putting its players' safety in danger on national television. They were a national laughingstock. I remember before that first Thursday night game against Utah in 2015, the entire Fox Sports crew said it would take Michigan 3 to 5 years under Harbaugh to be competitive. Except it took about 3 to 5 months with a transfer quarterback from Iowa that Iowa fans used to mock me since I live in Iowa. They were mocking me for taking on Jake Rudock. By the end of the year, he was a pro quarterback. By the end of the year, Michigan was in the top 25, dismantling an SEC power in their bowl game, and suddenly Michigan was back. Then the narrative became for year 2, well, can they take the next step? Can they be a top 10 team? Can they be a playoff contender? Sure enough, Michigan spent most of the year actually in the top 5, soaring as high as number 2 in the rankings before that fateful loss to the Iowa Hawkeyes I would just as soon forget, as I'm sure many of you would. Then we had the flat-out thievery and robbery in Columbus. Now, I am not someone that is a blame the refs guy. As we go through this podcast in the weeks and months that follow, who knows, maybe even years, you're going to find victimology not really my thing. I'm not really the refs screwed us or this should have happened. I really believe you take responsibility for what you can take responsibility for, especially when you're the winningest program of all time. Not just in total wins, but winning percentage. You have the largest living alumni body. You play in the largest stadium. Your coach makes $9 million a year, and 3 other assistants make over $1 million per. That means pretty tough to play the victim card when you have all of those advantages. But what happened last year in Columbus, I thought was the biggest screw job I've ever seen in a college football game, including the referees literally patting Ohio State players on the backside after they made outstanding plays. And that doesn't even count the controversial spot. Now, that doesn't mean Michigan is absolved of its guilt in that game. I thought the game plan at times was way too conservative, although that's to be expected considering Wilton Speight, our starting quarterback, was coming off a serious shoulder injury. But for the most part, Ohio State was handed that game, I believe, from the refs, and you'll never convince me otherwise because I'm going to throw this one stat right in your face. When was the last time, like ever, like in the entire history of college football, that a team had more than 50 running plays, gave up 8 sacks in the game, and wasn't called for a single holding call, folks? Over 50 running plays, you gave up 8 sacks, which means your offensive line was struggling to block the other team the entire afternoon. Those were just the 8 times they got home. There were plenty of other times that they created pressure. 8 sacks Michigan had that day against the Buckeyes, over 50 running plays, no holding calls, including that infamous run from Curtis Samuel where I think he went back and forth 5 times, no holding calls. That was a screw job, flat out. Nothing Michigan could do about that. But then there was the bowl game against Florida State. And it looked like Michigan just did not want to be there in the first half. They looked like the classic, highly ranked team, disappointed at how their season ended, that really didn't show up for the bowl game. Then you had the furious comeback in the second half before the letdown at the end with the kickoff return. And then something you rarely saw, Jordan Lewis's 4 years at Michigan, him beaten in man-to-man coverage, and the Wolverines lose. So despite the fact we're going to go into training camps in July here with upwards of 19 guys on NFL rosters, the Wolverines lost 3 games, all of them, in heartbreaking fashion. Still, they ended the season ranked in the top 10, so now the new media narrative is Harbaugh's overrated. Harbaugh's overexposed, of course, by the very same media that covers literally every time he uses a damn urinal. I mean, of course he's overexposed. You guys have overexposed him, for goodness sakes. You know, when Jim goes to a ball game, he's not holding a press conference. You guys follow him everywhere he goes. But this is kind of the media game, and I know because I work in the media. We love to build people up and then tear them down because as many good ratings as the buildup creates, the tearing down usually creates even more. So now this is what we're hearing. Well, all Harbaugh's done is finished third place in the Big Ten East 2 years in a row. Well, that's a bit of a misnomer, guys. There are only two coaches in the Big Ten that have won more games in the league than Harbaugh the last 2 years are Paul Chryst at Wisconsin and Urban Meyer at Ohio State. If I came on here today and I said, Urban Meyer is 61-6, but has only won one Big Ten championship. He's an overrated head coach. What would I sound like? Yeah, a complete freaking moron. Because that doesn't tell the whole story. First of all, we don't live in an era of shared championships anymore. We have one true champion now. So it's harder than ever to win a Big Ten championship. And when you're 61-6, you're freaking good at your job. You're probably a certified Hall of Famer. You're one of the best in the country. But that's sort of what folks are doing to Jim Harbaugh when they say, well, he's only finished in third place 2 years in a row. Well, yeah, but he's also 20-6 in those 2 years as well, with a program that was averaging 7 wins, barely 7 wins a season, the decade before he arrived. But this, again, this is the narrative that Jim is up against, and the Michigan Wolverines are up against it as well. For a lot of people, it has been a novelty act, but the novelty act is about to wear off. Coach Harbaugh and the Wolverines, it's now for them anyway, and I'm sure it always has been for them. But for the media narrative, for the fan narrative, it is now about competing for and winning championships. And that's the way the game is played. The marker always moves. In 3 years, Jim hasn't even been the coach here 3 years. And it's already gone from it'll take 3 to 5 years to rebuild to all he's done is finish in third place in the Big Ten 2 years in a row in the East Division. Now, here's why this matters. Because Jim recognized, at least this is my theory, I think Jim recognized when he arrived at Michigan that the number one thing he had to redo was rebuild the brand. Michigan as a brand had fallen on hard times. It was more meme and not of the flattering variety than brand. And I think that's where a lot of the media antics, the public appearances and the like, that's where those came from. Jim's recognition that the brand had to be rebuilt. And in many cases, the brand of Michigan is stronger than what the actual record is. I love my Wolverines, but we still haven't won a Big Ten championship since 2004. This is the longest streak between championships Michigan has had since the 1950s. So we have rebuilt the brand. Well, we should say Jim, largely, has rebuilt the brand. But when you're in the brand building business, if you live by the brand, you can die by the brand. And sooner or later, if you don't win championships, the brand will snap back. A lot of the success that we've been able to have from a brand building standpoint, from a recruiting standpoint, is because of the popularity of the coach, because of the power of his personality, and the way he's been able to rehabilitate the brand. But if this becomes a rebuilding season, and we're still talking about a football team that has up to 18 new starters on it, that's a possibility. I don't think that will happen, but it certainly is a possibility. You could see people now say, well, maybe the brand isn't that strong. You could see folks now say to recruits, well, Jim really hasn't won anything. I mean, all he is now is a sideshow. That's what's really at stake this season for Michigan football. So how do they do it? How do they overcome the loss of so many key players? In a moment, we're going to take a look at something I put together for our first show. We're going to look at a unique ranking of the teams in college football. Now, these are not my official predictions. I do my preview every July, and that'll be one of our shows coming up here on the Michigan podcast. But we're going to look at what the talent roster is for all of the top teams in the sport. Really, what kind of a roster foundation are they looking at, and where does Michigan, with a third-year coach, rank there? And it'll give you an idea of why I think, even if I'm not a Michigan fan, I would think this just as a college football fan. I think Michigan is going to be the most fascinating team to watch in college football this year. I'll explain why in a moment.
Angler at the 45, he goes back, he's looking for a receiver, he throws downfield to Carter, Carter hands up, Carter is there! Carter scores! Look at those Wolverines, 95 Wolverines!
Now, I I have been doing an annual college football preview since I was a sophomore in high school. I had a friend of mine challenge me when I thought Athlons and Lindy's and those guys didn't know what they were talking about. He said, hey, you should do your own if you think you're a know-it-all. So I did. I grabbed a spiral notebook. That's right, back in the day, kids, we had to actually write stuff down. I grabbed a spiral notebook with an ink pen and did my own college football preview. And I predicted back in the day, this was 1988, first time I ever did this, that two independents, Florida State and West Virginia, would play for the national championship because I like West Virginia's schedule. They had this quarterback named Major Harris. Well, I was right about West Virginia, and I thought, wow, man, this is easy. I'll do this every year. Well, I've been doing it every year since 1988, and I don't think I've been that right ever. So it's not that easy, okay? And I think it's now getting harder than ever to do a college football preview because the game is evolving. It is changing. What's happening is we are now becoming more and more like college basketball. Now, we don't have the one and dones, but we are seeing a rash of players going pro early. And what that is doing, it's taking the old metric of how we used to evaluate teams. I mean, the way that we used to take a look at who we thought was going to be good the next year, we'd always look at their returning starters, right? How many starts their returning quarterback had, or if they had to break in a new quarterback. And that wasn't, a tried and truism, but because there was always a team in every era that had such a stockpile of talent they could quickly reload. You think of Nebraska under Tom Osborne, the 14 years in a row that Florida State finished number 4 or better in the final AP poll. USC under Pete Carroll, right? There's always been a team in every era, the Miami teams under Jimmy Johnson and Dennis Erickson, that every single year you knew the roster foundation they had was so strong that they did not rebuild, they would reload. But for most of our lifetimes, if you're my age or older, and I'm 43, what that meant was there might be 1, 2, maybe 3 teams where that was true of. What we're seeing nowadays, though, is there's a tier of teams that this is true of. And I'll just show you the last playoff. Last year, Alabama, Clemson, Washington, and Ohio State were the 4 teams in the playoff. All 4 of those teams in their playoff games played at least 9 true freshmen. At least 9. All 4 of those teams started a true freshman on the offensive line. I mean, we never saw true freshmen start on the offensive line unless they were Orlando Pace when we were kids. And for those of you that are a younger generation, you don't even remember who Orlando Pace was. And last year, we saw all 4 of the playoff teams starting a true freshman on the offensive line. See, the game has changed. So many guys are going pro early. Ohio State has lost 15 players to early entrance to the NFL draft in the last 2 years. That's about 2/3 of a recruiting class. When you're losing that kind of talent, LSU went through a span where they lost 17 players in 2 years. That is almost an entire recruiting class. When you're losing that many guys early every year, that forces you to play other guys in their place earlier than you ever did before. So I think it's not enough now to just simply look at returning starters. I think we've got to take a deeper look now and look at what I call a roster foundation. So what I've done for the purposes of today's first initial pilot podcast is I've taken a look at all of the Power 5 teams in Notre Dame, who I just included in the ACC because they're in that conference for every sport other than football. So I took a look at all of the Power 5 and Notre Dame, all the Power 5 conference teams. And I went back over their last 4 recruiting classes, 2014 through 2017. And I went to 24/7 Sports because they do the composite recruiting rankings. And as best as I could, I took a look at how many players they've retained from those 4 recruiting classes, how many guys they've even had transfer in and where they might have been ranked. And I applied a point system. 5 points for a 5-star, 4 points for a 4-star, 3 points for a 3-star, and then I didn't give any points beneath that because that would require a high level of player development to get those 2-star or lower players to have major impacts on your roster typically. Now, I also didn't include red shirts. Why? Because, frankly, true freshmen have more of an impact today in college football than fifth-year seniors do. There's a few programs that rely heavily on fifth-year seniors, like Stanford. We'll talk about them in a moment. But for the most part, it's pretty systemic in college football nowadays. True freshmen matter more than fifth-year seniors do because of how often guys are either leaving early or are now grad transferring to schools where they think they can play more in their final year. So when we took a look at the Big Ten, let's just start there. What's the talent base for the various teams in the Big Ten? We're going to do these in descending order. According to the rankings of the last 4 recruiting classes, the least talented team in the league is Illinois. with 215 points. When you consider how much talent surrounds Illinois' immediate recruiting area, you got to try to suck like that. I mean, you just got to go out of your way to be the least talented team in your conference when your state is home to one of the country's largest population centers. And that leads us to our next school on the list as well, Purdue. They're not surrounded by a major population center. They don't have a huge in-state recruiting base, even though they are a school that has had great tradition in the past. You go back to the Bob Greasy, Leroy Keys days, the Drew Brees, Joe Tiller days, even when Leon Burnett and Jim Young were the coach back in the day in the 80s. And they had Jim Everett in competitive teams. And also in the late 70s when they had teams that were even playing Bo Schembechler in Michigan for Big Ten championships. You see there the big rebuilding job that their new coach, Coach Jeff Brom, has there in West Lafayette. The next school on our list, looking at talented rosters in the Big Ten, another school with a huge in-state recruiting base, and that is Rutgers. Third to worst in this league in roster foundation. So there you see Chris Ash has a major rebuilding job on his hands. Now, what you're going to notice as we go through the rest of the Big Ten, though, is those schools are on a separate level in terms of ineptitude, and there's a lot more balance elsewhere. Next up on the list, Northwestern. You may be surprised with Clayton Thorson, Justin Jackson, but at 244 points, they're still, when we look at the rest of the point totals here in the league, they're basically a middle-class team. It also gives you an idea of how good Pat Fitzgerald, and I'll confess he's one of my man-crush coaches, they do a heck of a job in player development there at Northwestern because they're closer in talent to Rutgers than they are the teams at the top of the conference. The next spate of teams here, a lot of balance. You have Iowa at 253 points. This is largely a developmental program. They're a program that doesn't reload as quickly, and they're going to miss some key pieces this year, especially at quarterback, and we'll see how quickly they can reload, especially with the coach's son as the brand new offensive coordinator. Just above Iowa in terms of the most talented rosters in the league is Maryland at 258. Now, one thing to keep in mind about these numbers, these aren't exact calculations. I mean, I did the best I could to research how every team has been able to retain their players, but the numbers aren't perfect. Look at these more as an educated approximation. So essentially what those numbers tell you is Maryland and Iowa largely have very similar talent bases. That'll be true of the next team on the list as well. This may surprise you, but Wisconsin comes in very middle class at 261 points. But I think, again, that is a testimony to how good they do up there in Madtown at player development, going back to the program Barry Alvarez originally established there in the early to mid-90s. Next on our list here, looking at most talented teams in the Big Ten, Nebraska at 262 points. So Nebraska and Wisconsin, virtually the exact same roster foundation in terms of talent. But if you've looked at the results on the field, it is clear Wisconsin is doing a much better job developing that talent than the Huskers are. Minnesota, P.J. Fleck is taking over a team that has been regularly winning 7 to 9 games since Jerry Kill rebuilt this program a few years ago. And at 263 points on his roster, where they rank in the Big Ten, there are certainly enough players there for P.J. Fleck to be a factor in the Big Ten West his very first season there at Minnesota. This team may surprise you. Kevin Wilson did an excellent job stockpiling players at Indiana. He has handed Tom Allen, the new coach there, a talented defense. This might be the best defense Indiana's had since the late 80s, the Van Wader days when they had Anthony Thompson. If they can develop Richard Legow, if he can take an extra step as a quarterback, you can see there that they have a talent base that is going to make them very competitive with most of the Big Ten. Now we get to the next team on the list, Sparty, Michigan State, at 268. Some of you may think, given the 3-9 season they had last year, this number may seem a little high. I should let you know, I've not included any of the alleged names that may be suspended, kicked off the team with all the scandals. They basically had an entire scrimmage squad on the sidelines or not in attendance at their spring game back in March. So Michigan State's number could change dramatically between now and the start of the season when we find out for sure who's actually on the roster or not. Which brings us to our beloved Michigan Wolverines. Their point total is 297 points. Now, there's something about Michigan's point total, though, that is unique in all of college football. And it's why I think the Wolverines are going to be the most fascinating team to watch this year. So we started this exercise by pointing out there is a certain tier of program in college football that are recruiting at a level right now, it really doesn't matter how many returning starters they have. And I would argue 3 of the teams that were in the playoffs last year are on that list: Clemson, Ohio State, and Alabama. Michigan, the last 2 years, has recruited at the level that those schools I've just mentioned and others that need to be in that reload mode have been able to recruit at. But the difference is Dabo Swinney, Urban Meyer, Nick Saban, others have been at their schools longer than Jim has been at Michigan. Listen to this number, for example. Michigan, of all the schools in the country, their point total was the highest based out of the last 2 recruiting classes. In fact, 72% of the total points that made up Michigan's roster foundation came from the 2016 and 2017 classes. That's a yo, Lee Corso. 72%. Translation, this is going to be one of the youngest teams, if not the youngest team, in major college football this year. Here's what it also means. When we do this a year from now, this will be one of the 5 or 6 most talented teams in the country at the trend line that they are ascending to. But right now, this is going to be a very young team, even younger than you thought beyond the returning starters. Why? Well, the 2014 class under Brady Hoke for Michigan is largely a washout. The 2015 class, Jim didn't take the job until almost New Year's Day. I think it was December 28th. So you're talking about 4.5 weeks to really recruit. That's not a lot to recruit on the fly. And so I think that class was largely ranked in the 30s and the 40s by most recruiting services. So the reason why that Michigan's going to be a fascinating study this year is because the last 2 years, Harbaugh and company have recruited at the rate you need to reload with the elite programs in college football. But they've only been doing it the last 2 years. Without that extra 3rd or 4th year of outstanding recruiting, can Jim reload on the fly as quickly as the elite coaches he's often compared to have been able to, with a head start in both reloading and recruiting? We're going to find out when the season starts, especially because that very first game is against Florida, a team you'll see when we look at this nationally is just about even Steven when it comes to talent with the Wolverines. Pardon the even Steven pun. Which brings us to the top 2 schools in the Big Ten. Penn State at 302 points, slightly higher than Michigan, and most of that is, frankly, James Franklin. He's not recruited as well as Harbaugh has the last 2 years. No. But he has had an extra year to recruit, which gives Penn State just a smidge of an advantage in terms of overall talent. And I don't have to tell you who is number 1, Ohio State. And they are number 1 by far, 335 points. And that is with, folks, losing 15 players the last 2 years early to the NFL draft. That is absolutely astounding. In fact, let's take a look at where Ohio State ranks nationally. If we were going to do a top 25, not taking into account scheduling, not taking into account coaching and player development, if we were just going to look at recruiting rankings, which I would argue are as accurate as they've ever been, because now you've got major companies invested in entities like Rivals and Scout and 24/7 and ESPN now with major resources behind this. I think if you watched the first round of the NFL draft, you saw how accurate a lot of these recruiting rankings are. Now, when you get below 3-star prospects and those guys have to be developed, it's really tough to tell who's the 68th best right guard in the country compared to the 78th. But for the most part, all of the scouting services do a pretty good job identifying who the top 250, 300 players in the country are. They just may differ on where those guys are ranked within that ranking. So let's take a look at the most talented teams in the country just based on roster points. And you're going to see a trend line here that if you're an SEC hater, you're not going to enjoy. Washington, in the playoff last year, falls all the way down to number 25. Why? because they lost over 25 points in guys that left early for this year's NFL draft. They took a big hit from early entrants, including guys in the secondary to the NFL. The rest of this top 25, Mississippi State, which was 5-7 last year, guys, comes in at number 24. Again, this is just total points on the roster foundation point scale I created. I'm not ranking these teams. This is just where their point total put them. Kentucky at number 23. This is a program that was so proud of winning 7 games, they gave their kids championship rings for this over the offseason. Arkansas, under Brett Bielema, the former Arkansas coach, they can't win more than 7 games in a year, but according to the recruiting rankings, they're the 22nd most talented team in the country. And the team at number 21 is going to surprise you, Clemson. Well, Steve, I thought you said they recruited an elite level. They do, but the problem Clemson has is their 2014 class has been decimated. Artavius Scott, Wayne Gallman, Mike Williams, Deshaun Watson, all those guys graduated early in 3 years, all went pro, all the biggest name recruits out of their 2014 class. So their last couple of classes have been dynamite. But the 2014 class is holding Clemson back, which also shows you they may have a little bit more reloading to do at Death Valley this year as the defending national champions than a lot of people in the preseason magazines are going to believe. We move on. Number 20, Ole Miss. You can see those guys know how to cheat. I mean, if you're going to cheat, good players. To consider that Ole Miss still has a top 20 roster with all the guys they've lost to the NFL and NCAA sanctions goes to show you that they knew exactly which players to buy. Procure. Allegedly recruit. Yeah, well, allegedly. We'll go with that word. At number 19, UCLA. They're the second most talented team in the Pac-12 right now, which shows you why Jim Mora is on the hot seat. He should be. He has underperformed the last 2 years. Miami is number 18. And imagine if Brad Kaya had decided to come back for one more year rather than be a 6th-round pick of the Detroit Lions. Miami might have been a preseason top 10 team this year. Number 17 is Stanford. Now, Stanford, when you just look at their point total of the last 4 classes, would not be in the top 25. But I mentioned there are a couple of outlier programs that still rely heavily on 5th-year seniors. Stanford is one of them. If you include the 5th-year seniors that Stanford has on their roster and in their 2D for 2017, then they do have one of the top 20 rosters in college football. In fact, they've got 30 points of roster talent in 5th-year seniors alone at Stanford. And they're at number 16, your Michigan Wolverines, right there in the middle of the top 25, but with most of that talent coming from the last 2 recruiting classes. So a very, very young team. Now let's look at the top 15. Penn State, just ahead of Michigan at number 15. Penn State and Michigan, 2 of the only 3 Big Ten teams to make this list. Virginia Tech may surprise you. Give Frank Beamer a lot of credit. He did Justin Fuente a solid. He did what, frankly, a lot of aging coaches don't do, which is leave a pretty solid stacked cupboard for his successor. Virginia Tech's another team from the ACC, much like Miami. If their quarterback, Gerard Evans, had decided not to declare early for the Canadian Football League draft, they could have very well been a preseason top 10 team with the talent base they have returning. Moving on, Notre Dame at number 13. You can see why Brian Kelly is on the hot seat. They went 4-8 last year with a top 20 roster talent foundation and with a highly drafted quarterback starting under center. Just that should not happen. You've got to coach your way to that suck when you've got those 2 advantages. So now you know why Brian Kelly is under pressure. At number 12, Michigan's opening opponent, the Florida Gators. Some of you may wonder, Steve, what's the difference in talent between Florida and Michigan? Florida comes in at about 305 points. So Florida and Michigan's talent difference is minuscule. The difference is how young Michigan's top talent is compared to Florida's. And number 11 is USC. Now, they're a team that will be top 5 probably in every preseason poll. And even though they do return Sam Darnold, their overall talent base, as they've gone through all the myriad, what are they, our 4th head coach if you count Ed Orgeron when he was the interim in the last 5 years, all of those coaching changes have hurt their attrition rate. So even though they do return what a lot of people think is a top 5 team, their overall talent on the roster is not ranked in the top 10 in the country. These teams are number 10, Texas A&M. Now you know why Kevin Sumlin's on the hot seat. In fact, Texas A&M since 1999 has had one season where they had double-digit wins, and that was the year they sprang Johnny Manziel on the SEC, and he won the Heisman, and they upset Alabama. That is the only time since 1999 the Aggies have had double-digit wins in the regular season. They are averaging 4.5 losses a year recently under Kevin Sumlin, despite a top 10 roster foundation in terms of talent. Number 9 is Texas. And you look at the way Texas is positioned, I'm going to call this shot right now. Tom Herman will be this year's Jim Harbaugh. Jim took over Michigan at the absolutely perfect time. Brady Hoke had recruited fairly well in the couple of classes preceding him. He just couldn't develop that talent, couldn't coach it up, couldn't lead a program. But these were talented players ready for a culture shock, ready for a culture change, that were ready to win now. And they did. They went from 5-7 to 10-3. They doubled their win total in Jim's first year. Last year, Texas was 5-7. I'm telling you right now, they're going to win 3 to 5 games more this year than they won last year in year one under Tom Herman. In fact, if you look at, Tom Herman, Michigan, Freudian slip, Tom Herman, my bad. If you look at Tom Herman's history, he always makes a splash in his first year. First-year offensive coordinator at Iowa State, they go from 3-9 to 7 wins. First-year offensive coordinator at Ohio State, they go from 6-6 to 11-0. First-year head coach at Houston, they end up winning a New Year's Six game. I think you'll see that trend continue for him at Texas this year with the talent he's inheriting. Number 8, this may shock you, Tennessee. Because a lot of us looked at all the players they lost and thought, hey, the window has closed on Butch Jones. Maybe he's got a little bit more of a shot to save his job than we thought with the talent he has on hand. Number 7, Oklahoma. They're, along with Texas, the class of the Big 12. I don't think that would really shock anybody. Number 6, LSU. LSU proves to you that you can't hide your quarterback in college football. I mean, if we would have done this exercise at any moment the last 10 years, LSU would rank in the top 3 to 6 every single season. Yet they had not been a factor nationally in the last 4 years. Why? Quarterback play so anemic. You can't hide your quarterback in college football. No matter how many pros you have everywhere else on the roster, and LSU has proven that. Now we get to the top 5 teams in terms of talent in the country. And I did put their point total there so you get an idea of how much there's a separation between them and the rest of college football. Florida State, clearly the class of the ACC, 334 points. Ohio State, clearly the class of the Big Ten at 335 points. Auburn, that may shock you. Second most talented team in the SEC at 341 points. There is frankly no excuse for Gus Malzahn this year to not have a team that is in the playoff conversation, at least going into the Iron Bowl at the end of the season. And then you look at the top 2 teams. You may be shocked to see Georgia there. Well, this is the state that this year in the draft produced more NFL players than any other. And in terms of total roster points, they're number 2 in the country heading into this fall. And number 1, though, will not shock anybody. This is what happens when you have the number one recruiting class in the country, like 6 years in a row. It's Alabama with a bullet. And that includes all of the talent they've lost. Now, you see a trend here? Yeah. There's a reason why every spring SEC leads the pack in players drafted, because even though their recruiting rankings are slightly inflated because of all the oversigning done in the SEC, there is no question they do a better job of corralling talent than anybody else. So where does Michigan stack up? Well, now you can see in just 2 years of recruiting how much Harbaugh, look at that number right there. Look at how much he has closed the gap. And for those of you listening on podcast, Michigan is at 297 points. The rest of these teams are at 330 points or higher. So you can see there is still another step for Michigan to take to be in this perennial elite category in college football. But you also get a point of how far the Wolverines have already come in just heading into the 3rd year of the Harbaugh era, how much he's already been able to close the gap on the top teams in college football.
I've never seen so many consecutively as we have in the second half, Frank. Most unusual. But then to have a team take advantage of those turnovers is, oh no, to add insult to injury. A safety. Chris Godfrey coming in and getting on Montana. I'll tell you, when things go, they go.
That's we talk about momentum, Chris, and that is a factor in any football game. When things start going your way, that little something extra in your block and your tackling and your warding off blockers is the difference in how the game turns out.
And now our question of the week from our audience here on the Michigan podcast. This comes from Annie54 at Go Blue Wolverine. And by the way, if you're on any of the Michigan sites, Go Blue Wolverine, the Wolverine, Maize and Brew, MGO blog, or you're just on social media, look us up at Michigan Podcast. Contact us via Facebook at Michigan Podcast. If you have any questions you want to have us answer on any future episodes, we're happy to do so. But Annie54 says, what should be the role of the NCAA in regards to moral issues like what happened at Baylor and Penn State? Should there be an independent commission that oversees such gross misconduct and cover-ups such as these? Let me start with the second part first. I think I speak for all of us when I say the last thing we need from the NCAA is another bureaucracy. All right? So, no, I would not be in favor of an independent commission. But to the first part of Annie's question, the NCAA should get involved when people have broken rules that give them a competitive advantage. One of the arguments I've been hearing since Penn State's child sexploitation scandal with Jerry Sandusky and now the Baylor gang rape scandal that we're sadly privy to at the moment, one thing I keep hearing from some folks is, well, these are moral issues, and as abhorrent as they are, the NCAA has no jurisdiction. Pardon my French, that's complete and total horsebleep. Here's why. Why did they cover up what Jerry Sandusky was doing for years at Penn State? Well, Steve, they didn't cover it up. You're right. Former high-ranking officials at Penn State only pled guilty to crimes they didn't commit. Right on. I got you. Why did they cover up Sandusky or look the other way or plead willful ignorance? Why did they not want to know? Why did they not try to confirm their suspicions? Why did they just say, hear no evil, see no evil? Why did they turn a blind eye and a tin ear? Why did they do that? Because they wanted to protect the football program, guys. That's why. That's why they did it. Why'd they want to protect the football program? So they could have a competitive advantage. Okay? That's why. The reason why this is a scandal is it was covered up / ignored. And the reason why it was cover up / ignored is because they did not want to hurt the program's ability to win. That is the very essence of cheating for a competitive advantage. That's exactly what happened at Baylor. Why? Why did they not know? Or why did they pretend not to know? Why did they lie? Why did they look the other way? Why? Well, because they were having unprecedented success. You got to go back to the Miracle on the Brazos with Grant Taft in the early 80s. You know, it wasn't too long ago Baylor had the longest streak between bowl appearances in all of college football. They were a doormat. All right, they had just come up with enough success under Robert Griffin and others to raise the money to build a new stadium, to have state-of-the-art facilities. They were a national brand in college football. That's why they covered this up, is they didn't want to hurt the program. Because if it had come to light what was really going on, they would have problems retaining the players not involved. They would lose recruits to other schools, which they did, meaning they would suffer a competitive disadvantage. The reason Penn State and Baylor both ignored and or lied and or covered up what was going on at their schools, the heinous, wicked, immoral activity, the reason why they did those things to not let it come to light is because they didn't want to suffer a competitive disadvantage, which in my opinion, Annie, absolutely makes it the jurisdiction of the NCAA. Great question. And now this week's Twitter poll. We asked you this question at Michigan Podcast on Twitter. The last 2 years, 3 teams ranked 12th or lower in the preseason AP poll made the college football playoff. Who will continue that trend in 2017? And I've picked 4 teams that I think are pretty talented and are likely to be ranked 12th or lower when the AP poll comes out in August. Michigan, Texas, Stanford, and Georgia. And I guess I shouldn't be shocked that followers to the Michigan podcast think Michigan's the team most likely to follow through on that trend. By the way, those of you who had Texas, that was your choice, who was number 2 on this poll, I told you earlier, I think that's a pretty smart money pick. I think you'll see them take a big leap in Tom Herman's first year. We'll come back and wrap up this first edition of the Michigan Podcast in a moment.
From the coast of Lake Michigan to the coast of Lake Huron is Russell Davis in for his second touchdown of the afternoon. 52 yards in 9 plays, and the first time it was 80 yards in 11 plays. Michigan leads 13 to zip, and Jerry Zuber is kneeling at the 10-yard line. Calm down, Ufer, calm down. It's spotted. He rolls out to the right. He's going to run with the ball, and he has 2 points. He has 2 points. Oh, Bo Schembechler, Joe Falls, who says he plays dull and boring football.
Now, I hate to end this on a sour note, Michigan fans, but a word of warning here on our very first episode. The Wolverines open the season September 2nd against Florida, one of the powers of the Southeastern Conference, in prime time at Jerry World. They will be a tough enough opponent. But when we learned in the last couple of weeks that Florida's coach can wrestle sharks naked and then spoon with them on social media, the fear factor increased exponentially. When another team's coach can wrestle and spoon with sharks while throwing his junk out there shamelessly and with pride, that's a team that eats nails for breakfast, guys. That is a team to be much feared. Of course, Jim McElwain, the Florida coach, is denying that that is him. Right. That'll do it for the very first week of the Michigan Podcast. Now, we're off next week with the Memorial Day holiday, but back at it again every single Tuesday. Remember, subscribe here to our channel on YouTube. Click like on our videos. Follow us on Twitter at Michigan Podcast. Like us on Facebook as well. Help us get the word out about our brand new show. And go Blue.